Hi, everyone. This is Rob Packard from Medical Device Academy. Today, we are doing a recording on human factors and usability engineering. Our guest lecturer today is Bryant Foster from Research Collective. His firm is the #1 firm that we recommend to clients that need help with human factors studies and for either a 510K or a CE marking submission. And in fact, this week we actually have a client that is going to be doing a formative study at their facility in Arizona, and one of our employees is attending to help with the study. So I will leave it off to Bryant to give the presentation, and then we'll maybe do a little bit of Q&A at the end. Off to you, Bryant.
All right. Well, thank you, Rob. Really excited to be presenting and get, I guess, a chance to talk to your audience. I'm grateful for the opportunity. As Rob said, I am a Vice President of Human Factors at Research Collective, and we are a human factors and usability consulting company. So this is what we do, and we're based in Tempe, Arizona, but work really all over the world. And we're grateful for some of the work that has come our way through Rob and his company. So looking forward to talking now. I guess a little bit about me. I have a lot of experience in human factors for medical devices and combination products. So in vitro diagnostics, and I instruct for the RAPS, Regulatory Affairs Professional Society, and have a master's degree in applied psychology and human factors from Arizona State University. So to start discussing human factors, I think it's important to note its position in the quality system regulation. So I kind of picture it nesting within quality system regulation and then within design controls. Again, all of these things are intended to help us reduce the risk associated with the medical devices, and human factors is the risk related to the use of the product. So it's reducing the risk related to when people are actually handling and using the product out in the field. Just a brief design controls recap. So it applies to Class 2 and Class 3 devices, and then some of the Class 1 devices listed here. And again, the purpose here is to kind of methodically reduce the risk and monitor how we're designing products, making sure that we're taking into account who's going to be using them, where they're going to be using them, and then so not only related to usability, but also, you know, what are the environmental factors that might affect the device and its functionality, its ability to perform what it is supposed to do when out in the real world. I apologize for the, well, I guess it doesn't look too bad, but this I pulled off one of the diagrams from the design controls documents released by FDA. This waterfall diagram shows kind of the process of identifying user needs up in that top left corner and applying that information that we know about the users into the design of the product. And getting to ultimately where we have a product that we've verified and validated. Verification meaning that the design of the device is right, and then validation being the device is the right device. It meets the needs of the users that we set out to meet back in the beginning. All right, and human factors will play into that, and I'll show another diagram in a minute here that links back to that waterfall diagram. So with human factors, we can go to the next slide. There's, again, human factors is going to apply the knowledge of human sciences to the design of things. So what we know from things like psychology, anthropology, is that people have certain abilities and they have certain limitations. And this is going to vary based on who we're talking about, the age of that person, the socioeconomic status, and all of these things are going to play into how they interact with the things that are being designed and created. And so as human factors engineers or practitioners, our goal is to try to match the design of the product to the people who will then be using it. And so a lot of us have backgrounds in psychology and other behavioral sciences to really understand, okay, what are people capable of doing? What are their perceptual abilities, their cognitive abilities, and likewise their limitations? And how then do we apply the knowledge of those things to the products that are being designed, so that we can really cater to the needs of people. A brief background on human factors. I just really like this picture, but its roots are in aviation. During World War II, planes like this were crashing at an alarming rate, and they weren't crashing while they were high in the sky. They were really crashing as they were coming in for landing. And so on the next slide, we see one of these planes all crashed, and this is what was happening. So these pilots were coming in, and at the time of landing, they were retracting the landing gear, which is definitely not good and would end up causing this sort of thing to happen. And it's really easy in these situations to say, okay, we need to train these pilots better. They obviously aren't receiving the right kind of instruction, or we need to teach them not to pull the landing gear at that time. But this wasn't happening in all of the planes, and these pilots were definitely qualified, some of the best pilots in the world at that time. So it could have been something else. And what they determined was, in certain planes, the landing gear and the flaps, which is another thing that would be interacted with at the time of landing, were very similar and placed close together. So the actual controls had very little difference between them. And so what they found was that if they changed the design and the shape of these actual controls, they could help give another clue to the pilots of what each lever or button was supposed to do. So on the next slide, there's an example of what they actually did. So you can see on the top right corner, we've got the landing gear. And so this gentleman, Alphonse Chapanis, who was working on this for the military, placed a rubber wheel on the landing gear, and then down on the flaps, a wing shape on the flap button or lever. And what this did was it really helped to create a mnemonic clue that would now take the load off of the pilot to now remember, okay, which one is which, or to look closely at the label. They could easily reach down and feel the difference between these two levers. And things like this are still used today. These are very new pictures, I think, from Cessna planes. Any pilots will potentially call me out on that, but I think this is something that's still used as a way to distinguish these two important mechanisms. And so this got started in aviation, but is definitely a big part of the healthcare product design landscape today. Three of the major standards out there are the IEC 62366-1. MHRA in the UK recently released a human factors and usability engineering guidance. And then the FDA Guidance for Human Factors and Usability Engineering was released in 2016. And all of these documents list or describe a human-centered design process. And so one of the things that I like most about what we do in human factors is it's not new. We're not inventing a new process each time. We're really applying the same principles that we're going to go through today to the design of different products. And so one product might be a very simple injection device, and another may be a class 3 artificial pancreas. And we're still going through the same process that you're going to see today, and each of these documents describes this process as well. So on the next slide, I think we talk about how these are harmonized. So no political undertones here, but just here we've got, Europe or the international standard IEC 62366-1 being harmonized as of 2016 with the FDA guidance. And so basically what this means is if you comply, and we tend to comply most often with the FDA guidance and use a template they have for documenting your process that you've gone through and how you've done your usability testing. And so we'll use that, and it will suffice both here in the US and internationally. A couple definitions and key terms I'd like to just get out before moving on. Human factors, usability engineering, and ergonomics would be the practice of designing products to meet the needs of users. So these are the overarching terms that we'll use. So the one I use most often is human factors. Depending on where we're at, we might use usability engineering more often, or ergonomics, but I'll refer to the practice as human factors most often. Usability testing is a specific method that we use to evaluate a product's ability to be used by the intended users. So it's what we're doing at the end of the product design process to say, okay, does this product meet users' needs and can they use it appropriately? We do that with a usability test. But there are many other evaluative techniques that we use during the process of developing a product to understand, first of all, what the user needs are, and then evaluating different designs or possible solutions to meet those needs along the way. But usability testing is the one that I think is most often thought about when thinking about getting a device through FDA. The human factors needs it's a validation usability test, which comes up here in a second. So formative usability testing is the type of and not all formative tests are usability tests. Like I mentioned, we could do kind of earlier stage testing or evaluations where we don't actually have a physical product. But when we have a physical product or a prototype, we'll do formative usability testing where we'll have actual users use the product and get their feedback and evaluate or observe how they're using the product, and to see if they're using it in the way that we expect them to, and the way that we hope they would use the product. And lastly, validation usability testing. It's called validation usability testing in the FDA terminology, but in IEC 62366, the international standard, it's going to be referred to as summative testing. So those can be used interchangeably, and that is the final usability test done when the product is completely developed and designed to demonstrate that people can use, your intended users can use the product safely and effectively. So we'll talk a little bit more about those, but I just want to kind of describe those terms now so that if I use shorthand later, hopefully they make sense. This diagram is something we created a few years ago to describe this human factors process or human-centered design process that is described in the guidance documents, the FDA guidance and 62366. And so what we see here is it really can be broken down to 3 main steps. The first step being identifying our users, the environments in which they use the product, the device user interfaces, which includes the device itself, training, labeling, packaging, and then going outside and seeing if there are any known issues with this product. Is there anything out there that we can that we know is potentially problematic with maybe a previous product or a product like ours, that we should make sure that in designing this new product, we're not repeating those same mistakes. And lastly, identifying the critical tasks that are I guess, safety critical. So anything that could cause harm to the user if done incorrectly or not done at all. And we want to make sure we identify those, and that's what we will want to demonstrate the usability of in our validation testing. So that's the identify stage and one, and we're going to go through each of these in greater detail in the upcoming slides. We will also follow a formative usability process, which is designing, prototyping, and evaluating with real users. So getting those prototypes in front of the people who would be using it once it's fully developed, and getting their feedback and input on the design, and pushing that information back into the design to improve the usability and acceptability of the product. And lastly, step 3, performing that validation usability test, where we're demonstrating in the way through usability tests that people can use this product safely, and they can use it as intended. So I want to quickly just talk about risk and how it plays into what we do for human factors. So on the next slide, we've got a little bit of risk management reminder. So again, we're evaluating risk throughout the entire product development process. And whenever we see risk, we want to try to reduce it as much as possible. And as I mentioned earlier on, human factors and usability engineering is going to try to address the risk associated with use of the product. We could say misuse, but really it's anything related to use. We're going to say, okay, how can we reduce the possibility of someone getting hurt or worse with each interaction of the device. Okay, next slide. The risk calculation simply would be the severity of a potential harm plus the probability would equal our risk. And on the next slide, we have a little risk matrix, and this will come into play later, so I just want to bring this up now. But on the rows, we've got the probability of harm, and I don't have their anchors here, but I think most are familiar with these sorts of things. So as we move towards as we go up in the on this matrix, we're going to have more frequent probabilities, and then as we go to the right, our severities get higher. So the worst would be up here in the top right corner, where it's a catastrophic potential severity of harm, and it would likely happen frequently. And so our goal would be to, as you can see in the key up above here, those things in red, these are unacceptable risks that need to be mitigated as much as possible, and down to the insignificant risks that would likely not cause any harm and be unlikely to occur. So in ISO 14971, it discusses how manufacturers should address these potential risks in the product. And there's kind of a hierarchy of these mitigations. The first would be designing safety into the product so that in human factors, we use the term lockout. So a user is locked out from doing things incorrectly. So on the left here, we've got our pilot. If our autopilot works as it should, which I know is not always the case, but this now takes control of the situation. It removes the possibility of a pilot doing something incorrectly because it can take care of that process for the pilot. The next would be designing protective measures into the device. And so that would be, an example of that would be back to our example from the landing gear and the flaps, designing the product so that there's better cues for people to understand how to use it correctly. And so you're reducing the likelihood of them just picking the wrong thing because it's very difficult to know which one they should pick. And so we're taking protective measures through the device design. And then lastly, we could create a warning in the labeling or packaging that would ask people not to do something incorrectly. But as we all know, warnings and labeling are somewhat ineffective when it comes to their ability to keep people on the right course. So I think the goal would be to design inherent safety into the device. And then lastly, if all else, if we can't do anything else, we're down to trying to create labeling to warn people of a potential safety issue. So back to the process, and we're going to go to show you again those steps that we discussed previously. And now we're going to dive into each of those steps to lay out how this process works. So here again is the human factors process. And on the next slide, we're going to first discuss this in greater detail, identifying these 5 key components. And then on the next slide, we have a remake of the design controls waterfall, having removed those pieces, the review and the validation and verification. These 5 steps going down from user needs, starting at user needs. Human factors comes into play in these 3 steps in these areas. So identifying user needs, that is a good place to get human factors involved to perform early design research, going out to understand who the users are, where they're using the product, and then be able to make better decisions about how the device should be designed right from the start. So on the next slide, we're going to talk about identifying users. So when thinking about who the users of a product are, it's important to think not only of the our end user, but there's other people involved as well. Maybe purchasing has something to do with certain devices. Some devices come into the hospitals and they're put together by engineers, and so that may be a user group as well. And then one group that gets forgotten quite often is the group that cleans or reprocesses or sterilizes a device for reuse. So for reusable products, there's that user group as well that it will be responsible for making sure it's clean and sterile for the next use. So thinking through these different user groups is really important. And then secondly, thinking about within each of these user groups, what are their characteristics? So what kind of education do these people have? What training, how much experience do they have using devices like this? What are their physical abilities and limitations? Similarly, their cognitive abilities and limitations. And then lastly, an important thing is what is their emotional state when using this device? So something that would be used in an emergent setting would need to be designed a little bit differently than something that might be used at home, like the example here of this lady on her couch. And so you would use different characteristics within the device to meet the emotional state that the person is in at the time of use. Next, we're going to look at the environments that people use the device in. So thinking about the lighting, the noise, the flooring, anything that's going to affect their interaction with that product. And then temperature, how much space they have, and then other equipment that they're using in this space. So some products are very reliant on other products as well. So things like for surgical tools, the imaging that's being used, how do those interact with the imaging? And so thinking of those interactions will help the device design team to design a device that plays nice with those other products as well. I'd mentioned earlier defining the device user interface components. This is something that sneaks up on people quite often. So the device itself is easy to identify, but we can't forget about packaging and the labeling, the instructions for use. Then there's the physical part of it, and then the graphical user interface. And thinking through each of these is going to impact how this gets used. So making sure if it's going to be used by an elderly population that we're not making the packaging that's really difficult to unwrap or prepare. So just thinking through those things and how we're going to ship this device out. Then we want to look into the known use issues with any products that are like our device, or maybe a predicate device for a 510K type thing, or a previous model of the device that we are designing. And what the regulators want to see here is that we're not making the same mistakes. So if there's a known issue with a product that's very similar to ours, and our product either isn't aware of that or hasn't expressly designed out that potential issue, that there's going to be a problem. So we should really be aware of what's out there and how we can design the product to reduce the problems that are currently being seen or have been seen in the past with similar products. So a couple methods that can be used to go out and understand more about the known issues or the user population or their environments is to do a research method called contextual research. So this is going into someone's natural habitat. So here in people's homes and observing them using products or maybe in this example, it's a previous model. And then interviewing them and discussing and watching them use their product and really gaining an understanding and appreciation for what their process is of using it, and then maybe other workarounds. So the picture on the right here is an example. That's not one of the products that we were looking at, but that is a cart that this guy had built. Well, he didn't build it, but he, I guess, altered it so that it fit the product that the medical device product that he was carting around. So he created a workaround, and that's really important for a manufacturer to understand, because maybe there's ways that they can design these solutions that people have come up with right into their own product, so people don't have to make these solutions themselves. Another good example is participatory design. So having people who are really expert in the device space or this this space that we're talking about for whatever device for the device they might be using, and getting their input into the design of the new product. So on the next slide, there's some pictures that were drawn by clinicians working with a graphical user interface, and you can see that they're not necessarily artistic in their abilities here, but they're putting information on the screen, and that's really helpful as a designer to understand, okay, what should go on the screen, what information is important. Now we can take that and make it look really nice, but we know now the content that's helpful for them to have, so they can do their job properly. And lastly, in this first step of identifying is defining our critical tasks. And critical tasks are defined as those that, if performed incorrectly or not performed at all, could lead to harm. And it's important to remember that harm includes a delay of therapy. So if our product is intended to deliver some sort of therapy, it should do that, and delays could potentially be a critical task, because if it's not doing what it's supposed to do, it's really not helping that much. Of course, harm to patient or user. And then on the next slide, we're going to show how the critical tasks are defined using the severity of harm. So back to our risk matrix, we're going to really forget about probability altogether, and then grab all tasks that are of basically above a certain harm level. So one more slide, and you'll see for this, we're just going to get rid of negligible and minor and say anything that is serious, critical, or catastrophic is going to be one of our critical tasks that we need to make sure users can do appropriately or properly. And you can see that we don't care about the likelihood or the probability of these potential harms, but we care about the severity. And because the FDA guidance says it's really impossible to know with certainty how likely a harm would be to occur in the field. And so in usability testing, we're going to test all tasks that have a severity of harm that would cause, or I guess that would be that would cause harm to the patient or the user. So some examples of critical tasks. On the left, we've got a total artificial heart that is connected to a pump. So the connection between that artificial heart and the pump is very important, life-sustaining. And so making that connection, someone has to actually physically do that. And so that would be a critical task. That's a pretty easily identifiable critical task for a life-sustaining product. Others would be administering a dose appropriately from a syringe. And then on the right, a critical task for even things like consumer products like the Apple Watch, but communicating properly what the user should make of a diagnostic. That decision is important to the decision the user makes based on what we're informing them is important. And so it's important that the device deliver this information appropriately so that the user can understand it properly. A use-related risk table is an important part of identifying these critical tasks. So for risk analysis, we're going to be looking at all of the potential harms or hazards that could happen in a product. And the use risk analysis is a subset of the potential hazards related to the usability. So we write these up a little bit differently, but we pull in aspects from the risk analysis. So we start on the left with a task. And so a lot of times what we'll start with is a task analysis. So defining all of the tasks the users complete from start to finish, unboxing to disposal, or maybe even other tasks beyond those. But let's just say unboxing, use, and then disposal. And then within each task, there's subtasks. So if we're going to prepare a syringe for injection, well, one of the subtasks of that is removing the outer cap. And for each task, there are perceptual, cognitive, and action elements that are required of the user. So the user, in this case, needs to see, they need to perceive that there is an outer cap. They need to understand that the cap should be removed, and they understand how it should be removed. And then physically, they need to be able to grasp the syringe in one hand and then pull the syringe apart, or pull the cap off the needle. This is very granular in the level of detail, but it's really helpful to go to this level, because when we perform a usability test, if someone has an issue removing a cap, we want to be able to go back and say, okay, was this something related to the user not seeing the cap? Did they not know it was there? Did they not understand that it was supposed to be removed, or did they not understand how it was supposed to be removed? And then lastly, did they see the cap and understand that it needed to be removed, but they were physically unable to do so? And so each of these perception, cognition, or action elements will help us design the product so that we can remove any use errors that we notice on each subtask. So moving along in this, we will identify the potential use errors associated with, for example, here, removing the cap, and then the hazards associated with those. So you can see some of these are, the potential hazard would be the patient would not receive the dose. And then lastly, an accidental needle stick could happen, which could lead to infection. And the severity, as I mentioned with the matrix, each of these potential hazards has an associated severity. And so we link this back to the potential severity. You can ignore the medium, high. Sometimes these are numbers. Every group has a different way of doing this, but for this example, we just called this a high severity on the infection. And so because that's a high severity, we will call that a critical task. And so this will be part of what we need to demonstrate usability of in a validation study. So once we've identified our users, the environments, our critical tasks, we can now begin the formative usability process, which on the next slide, is step 2 in our design control when we're linking human factors to design controls. So if we start from the top again, we've identified our user needs. We're now putting those into the design, and we're starting the design process. And so routinely, we're going to evaluate the prototypes that we're creating to make sure that those are delivering on the user needs that were identified early on. So, if we've identified a user need for example, the volume being to a certain level, well, now as we're developing the product, we can go and have a prototype, and if that has the volume that we've decided needs to be in there, we can now see, okay, is that volume indeed the proper level that it needs to be for those users that we thought it was back when we identified our user needs. So simply put, the formative usability process is designing, evaluating, and repeating. So it's this iterative process of improving the device design through these regular evaluations with users. Some important pieces of or components of the formative usability testing. So we can identify individual components at this phase. An example might be for a product that has hardware and software. Sometimes it takes longer for the hardware to be prototyped than it would be for the software. Software can be prototyped usually pretty quickly. And so there's no reason to necessarily wait for the hardware and software to be combined and finished together. We might go out and identify or evaluate the software as it's being prototyped, and then gain knowledge about that and put that back into the hardware once that's ready. But so we're constantly trying to find ways to save time by evaluating what we have ready at that time. Methods include interview, observations. We can do heuristic evaluations, which is really an expert review by a human factors person. So applying the knowledge that we have about usability to the design of that product. We may identify in these formative studies new risks that come out, and that's not always desired by the manufacturer, but it really is important because those are eventually going to rear their ugly heads at some point. And so if we can do that in these usability tests, it's going to save a lot of heartache if they're not identified until the validation study, for example, or when it gets to market. Formative studies can be done with fewer users than the validation study. And we'll talk about the users or the participants needed for a validation study later. But for formative studies, we can go with about 5 to 7 participants. The number is going to vary, but really you can go with small numbers and identify many of the issues, as it's shown here, 85% or more of the usability issues in a product are going to be caught by a study with just 5 to 7 users. We're going to focus early on the critical tasks. So knowing that we're going to have to get those critical tasks through the validation study, we want to make sure we're focused on those. So prototyping those as early as possible and getting that feedback on those is going to help us reduce the number of surprises that we might get later on. And again, here we're just learning. We just want to learn as much as we can. A failure of a task in a formative study is not a bad thing. It's actually a good thing. We'd rather fail here than later on. And this also allows us a chance to perfect the study design before validation testing. So the usability testing is not a perfect science, and as I'll describe later, there's components of it that we're trying to make it as realistic as possible. So we're walking this line between simulation and realism, and so doing these formative studies helps us set up the process a little bit better, so that when we get to the validation study, we have a really good process that evaluates the tasks that we really need to. So here's an example of a study that could be done along the way in a formative study. So this would be a label comprehension study, or an evaluation of the instructions for use. And these are really important because many times, as I talked about earlier, the instructions become one of the mitigations. Unfortunately, some products, we just can't design out all of the difficulty in them. And so we do rely a little bit on the instructions to inform the user how to use a product. And if that's the case, well, then we need to make sure that our labeling and our instructions actually do mitigate that problem, that they do make sense. And so we can do label comprehension studies where we have people go through the process of using the device while reading the instructions. We actually ask them to read the instructions and perform the steps step by step as described in the instructions. And what we find there is that when people read the instructions, they don't always lead them to proper use of the product. Sometimes the instructions are confusing, or they actually lead them to do things inappropriately based on maybe a picture that doesn't make sense or some wording that is unclear. And so if we're going to point to the labeling later on as a potential mitigation, we need to make sure that we have evaluated those instructions and can show proof that if people do read them, they can use them, or they can make sense of them and perform the process correctly. Again, back to the prototype, test, and repeat, and focusing on those critical tasks early on. So I'll talk again about the critical task of connecting this artificial heart to the pump that it's connected to, that's keeping the patient alive. This is a really important step, and getting it done quickly and getting it done right the first time is really a matter of life or death. So when designing a new solution for this, it would be important to prototype it early on and then evaluate it right away with users. So on the next slide, there's an example of a 3D printed model of this potential connection. You can see how rough this design is, C clamped onto the table, again 3D printed, but getting feedback, user input on the design of this, and testing it with people who maybe have experience with the previous device or the previous system is really beneficial to understand if we're on the right track with whatever it is that we think we should go with, or whatever we're prototyping. And then, so here's an example of the similar formative study with foam models. So nothing very high fidelity, but we can get great feedback on the shape, the form factor, placement of different features like handles and buttons, and So that all of these studies can be done really quickly for not very much money to prototype what we need to evaluate it. But again, we're kind of moving linearly through the process of identifying what our users need and then applying what we think they need to the design of these prototypes, and then evaluating them along the way to make sure if we are indeed delivering on the user needs that we identified earlier on. So the formative usability process is, and I use process because it really is, it's not something that should happen one time. You know, a lot of times I think people think of a formative study as a one-off where, okay, you know we have to do a validation study, but we want to do a formative study first to see if we're, you know, on the right track. And that is good. I mean, that's better than going straight to a validation study. But I would say the better way to think about formative studies is a process where, as early as you can, you're getting those in front of people, getting input, and just moving ahead with confidence that what you're designing is in line with what people need. So the goal would be to do that up to the point to where we know that we have a product that people can use. They can effectively perform all of the critical tasks, and getting to now doing a validation study, which can truly be a formality at that point, where we know how the users are going to perform with it. Well, there's always a little uncertainty whenever you get people in a study. You know, people are pretty unpredictable. But if you have demonstrated through multiple formative studies along the way that people can perform these tasks, there's a lot less uncertainty going into the validation study. And so we like to think of the validation study as hopefully a victory lap more than a trial by fire, or this thing that we're really nervous about. And that really can happen if we've done the formative studies appropriately. But I want to talk a little bit about the validation study and its characteristics as described by 62366 and the FDA guidance. Back to our design controls, we are at the last flag on the right now, where we are validating the medical device. We'll go to the next page, and that'll describe a little bit more about this. So again, our goal of the validation study is not to learn. We don't want to learn anything about how people use this product, what they like about it, what they don't like. Our goal in a validation usability study is to demonstrate that people can use the device effectively without serious use errors. So the way the study is set up is it's a little bit more bare bones than what we do early on, where we're more engaging with our participants. At this stage, we truly are asking them to perform a procedure or use a product as they see fit, based on the device and the labeling and what they're trying to accomplish with it. And as a study moderator, we are completely out of the way and observing them as they use it, but we're not interacting, we're not engaging with them during that time. We want them to have the freedom to use the product and have the opportunity to do it correctly if the product is designed well. We don't want to get in the way of that. So it's a little bit more Spartan in terms of the study design. We need to have the final product in these validation studies. So a lot of times people ask, can we use a prototype? It's very high fidelity. It's but we don't want to go to tooling, because if later we find out in the validation study that there's issues, we don't want to have to work backwards. And that really goes back to the importance of the formative studies, because in the formative studies, we can definitely use prototypes. We can use the final prototype before the real market-ready product. And if that's the case, we can gain that confidence that people can perform the tasks effectively in that formative study. But when it comes time for the validation study, it needs to be the final product. So there's really no more opportunities to kind of go backwards if we find issues. with usability and the validation testing, we potentially would have to go back and change the way the device is designed. So it's not the time you want to learn those things. We need to have all interface elements available, which includes training. So we'll have a realistic training provided by, maybe the manufacturer rep, if that's how it's done. And then so yeah, people have everything from the labeling, packaging, training, everything they'd have when using this in the real world. And the FDA guidance for human factors asks for a minimum of 15 representative users per user group. And so this then has kind of stuck for all validation testing, but the international standard 62366 is not specific. It's not explicit in the number of users. So it's kind of just been adopted, the 15 users, but it's important to note that in the FDA guidance, that is a minimum of 15. There's no one that says you can't do more. And there are instances where you can get away with less than 15 for things like rare diseases where populations are really small, or if it's used by surgeons that are, few and far between, that there are arguments to be made for including less than 15, but the guidance specifically does ask for 15 as a minimum. We have to test all of the critical tasks. So anything that we defined in our use risk analysis as being at a severity that we're going to call a critical task, we are going to evaluate those in the validation testing. And along the way, we're likely going to evaluate other tasks, but we're going to pay particular attention to the critical tasks. And what I mean by that is, let's say for a syringe product, removing the cap is not determined to be a critical task. But of course, they have to remove the cap to use the product. Well, we're not going to give them an uncapped needle and have them skip right to the critical steps. We're going to give them something that's a little bit more realistic and have them prepare the needle, which would include it, removing the cap to get to where they can perform the injection. But so we'll have them remove the cap, even though that's not a critical task. But what we're focused on most are the critical tasks. And we'll talk about what I mean in just a second here about focused on the critical tasks the most. We're going to have realistic simulated use scenarios. So again, for a syringe, for an injection, we're not going to have people actually inject themselves. They're going to prepare the product in all ways for an injection, but then, and if they're going to do an injection, it's going to be into maybe a skin pad or a dummy, but they're not going to inject a real person. So everything is done through simulated use. And one thing that's important to remember here is that we can submit the study protocol in a pre-sub for review. So if this is an FDA facing study, the protocol can be evaluated similar to the way you might evaluate a clinical trial protocol to make sure it aligns with the agency's expectation. We can do that with a validation study protocol and make sure that the scenarios that we've chosen, the critical tasks that we've identified, and the user groups that we're testing with, we can make sure all of those are in alignment, that we have agreement from them on the way the study has been set up. I'm not going to go into this too much, but 15 users is cited in that FDA guidance. And so here, the reason why is a previous study that shows at 15 users, you're going to identify something like 98% of the usability problems in a product. But after that, you kind of get diminishing returns. So as you can see, 5 users, you might only get 85%. And so that's how the 15 users came to be. It's definitely not a statistically significant number. And as I'm going to discuss in the next couple slides, these studies don't deal with statistics at all. Everything is going to be a qualitative analysis of what was observed and identified in the study. Here's a couple examples of what validation testing might look like. So you can see on the left, we've got the participant using the product, video equipment set up, recording to make sure we can go back and, we're taking notes along the way, but it's good to have a record of what the person did and what they said, so that we can understand better or go back and determine, okay, was this something related to the product? Was it something related to the training? Maybe something they brought in from previous knowledge from other products they've used, because all of those are going to help us understand, should the product be revised or improved. On the right, more of a simulated surgical, you can see this is definitely not a surgical environment, but simulated in some ways to let the user do certain tasks that were important to that particular product. Validation testing is broken into three main phases. We've got the observation of task performance. So this is our simulated use section, where anything we can have them perform in a task, we're going to have them do that. So here, on the picture on the left, washing the device, we're going to have them do that. But there's other things that are really hard to have them perform. So we have to attack those through knowledge task comprehension. So things like understanding expiration dates or contraindications in the instructions. We will follow up on those and just make sure that the information in the instructions can be understood. And so that's how we get at those types of things that can't be simulated. And then lastly, we follow up with a qualitative interview where we're discussing, asking them how easy or anything they encountered in the product that was difficult or that they were confused about. Because again, what we're trying to do here is tease out any unobserved issues they may have had. So when observing them use a product, it may have looked very straightforward to us, but in their head, they may have been questioning, should they do, this or should they do that? And so through that qualitative interview, we're trying to get a better sense for anything that maybe didn't happen, but they were, that kind of been I guess what we call a close call. So something that they may have done incorrectly, kind of a flip of the coin, and they happen to do it correctly, but we don't want to rely on that flip of the coin for too many people out in the real world. In the validation usability report, this is directly from the FDA guidance. These are the sections that are contained in there. Sections 1 through 7, well, section 1 is our conclusion. So we're going to state whether this device has been found to be safe and effective in the hands of users. But then sections 2 through 7 are background information for the reviewer. So we're going to tell them, and you'll see how much this matches up with the 3-step process, that infographic that I showed earlier. We're going to tell the FDA or the reviewer who the users are, the use environments, the types of training they receive. We're going to define all the user interface components. We're going to summarize the known use issues. And then we're going to talk about the critical tasks that were identified through the use risk analysis. Section 6, describing any preliminary analyses, so any formative studies that were done that got us to the point to where we are now doing a validation study. Those are really helpful, because the last thing a reviewer wants to see is a product that just has a validation study and has perfect results, because it just doesn't look very realistic. But when you show the process that you've gone through of prototyping and evaluating through different methods and changing the design based on what we learned in those studies, it shows that iterative process that you'd expect that would lead to a product being able to pass a validation study. Being able to pass the validation study. And then lastly, section 8, really the meat and potatoes of that validation report is going into the details of the human factors testing, which I describe in greater detail in the next slide. So section 8 is broken down into the details of the study itself. So what was the environment that we tested in? How did that match the environment that we'd expect users to be in? who were the participants that we chose for the study? So what were their user groups, and how does that match the intended users that we have for the product? If we did training, what that training looked like, the critical tasks and the use scenarios that we used to evaluate those tasks. We define what successful task performance looks like. So we have listed out all of our successful task criteria or success criteria for each task, and then the methods that we're using to collect the data. And then, excuse me, our test results. So how did people perform on the simulated tasks that they were able to perform? Did they commit any use errors? Did they have any close calls or difficulties? That's what we're going to talk about in the results, along with the subjective feedback from the interviews, and then a detailed analysis of the root causes of any issues. So any use errors or difficulties that we saw are going to get broken down, and we're going to assign a root cause to each of those that's going to link back to something in the device or the training or something that led them to have that issue. So on the next slide is what that table, so this gets all written up into a table. And this is our take on what the FDA guidance has in their appendix of the FDA Human Factors Guidance. But it lists the critical task that was tested. So in this case, it was removing the needle cap, back to what we talked about earlier with the risk analysis. So removing the needle cap. A participant didn't do this correctly. So maybe instead of removing it by pinching and pulling, he tried to press it off, like kind of snap it off, I guess. And then you can see on the third column is an observation and follow-up. So we describe what happened here. What did the user do? What did they say in post-test debriefing? So this particular individual said he had had previous experience with needles that looked very similar. And in those other needles, he was flicking the cap off. That's the way they're designed to be used. But in this particular needle, it was a little bit different. The manufacturer wanted you to pull it off. And so because of this mismatch between what he was used to and what the current design is, he created, or he made this use error. And then so the likely root cause in the next column, we're going to assign a root cause. So what is it in the design of the product, in his training or previous experience, caused this particular use error? And I would say for something like this, that the needle does not indicate clearly that it should be pinched. So it left it up to the user to decide how he thought it could be removed, because it was not clear that the mechanism that it was intended to be used or removed in that way. And so, yeah, potentially it could be designed a little better to be clearer. The potential harm, not that this was not that he received infection from the study, but potential harm, again, back from our risk analysis of removing the cap incorrectly, would be an infection. And so a possible risk control could be providing grooves on the needle cover to indicate that it should be grasped and pulled. There's many other risk controls that could be designed, and maybe nothing's necessary at all, but that's just an example of something that could be designed. And then lastly, is a redesign needed? And this is the chance for the manufacturer to say, if we see this one time, and the manufacturer can say with a clear conscience that now, I mean, this is not something that we can see as a problem. We don't have to necessarily redesign every single problem we see in the usability testing. But if we saw this a number of times, 2, 3, 4 times, and people are creating the same or making the same mistake, then yeah, we may need to consider changing the design, because we're starting to see a pattern of these. And this is where it gets really difficult to make this determination, because there is no hard number associated with it. Again, depending on the criticality or the severity of the potential harm, it's it's going to influence how likely a redesign is needed. So something that, you know, it could cause great harm, one use error could be all it takes to cause it to need to be redesigned. But for something that is a little lower on the harm scale, then we could get away with, you know, 1, 2, 3, who knows how many would be able to go through. And this, at this point, it's going to be up to the determination of the review team looking at this. And I've seen some go through, and others come back where they say, you know, hey, this issue is definitely in need of some design change. So let's take a look at that. You know, redesign it and then reevaluate it. And in that case, the manufacturer would have to, you know, redesign this particular piece and then validate again this new piece. Not necessarily the whole validation study again, but validating any new components that changed after the original validation was done. So after validation study, this is where this gets rolled into the submission, appended to the submission, summarized, and then this later we're going to want to look and continue to look at the usability of the product as it's being used in the real world. So the simulated use testing that we're doing in usability testing is by no means perfect, and so, you know, for definitely continuing to look at how people are using the product in the field, any issues that are being encountered, that would be really important to keep doing as the device is out on the market. Conducting field visits, visiting with people, talking to actual users, and creating, so every product or most products are going to have a version 2 or a version 3 or 4. And so documenting now any known use issues that are going to be important to have documented when we get to you know, the submission and the design of the next version of the product. So that's it for the process, usability, human factors engineering. Rob, any questions? I feel like I talked a lot.
You did. I got to practice my interviewing techniques and do a better job of jumping in when I have a couple of comments, but I did take some notes. I really appreciate you taking so much time to go through this presentation with us. I found it really helpful. And there were some definite differences between the way I saw you emphasizing things than I've seen other human factors experts emphasize things. And I think yours fit much better with how I teach design controls and risk management.
Okay.
So I think that will be a good thing for anybody that's watching that and is also familiar with the training that I've done on design and risk. But one of the things I wanted to ask for a little bit of clarification about was on usability studies. You mentioned if somebody is going to do a usability study, they wouldn't, if they're going to do it with a needle, they're not actually going to go to the step of injecting themselves or puncturing the skin. However, when we were speaking with the FDA for a recent pre-sub meeting, and we discussed what type of human factors testing that would be required, they made a distinct, they defined usability very differently from the rest of the FDA. The IVD group thought of usability as you have to actually use the device in the way that it's intended with a real specimen. You can't, if for instance it takes a finger prick to take a blood glucose measurement, you can't skip that step and just have a drop of ketchup.
Yeah.
For instance, that won't cut it, because for a lot of these layperson tests in the IVD world, in order to get an accurate value, you have to make sure they can actually take a sample of blood. And a lot of people have trouble with that piece. They using the right lancet, doing a finger prick in the right location, being able to get a drop size of blood that's large enough. So there are a lot of things that, although you could evaluate each one independently, the FDA really is saying, for the IVD group, if you want to do a usability study, or when you do a usability study, because they're required, they're not optional, you shall actually um, take an actual specimen, and it shall be an actual layperson. Is that something you've experienced as well with IVD products, or have you experienced something a little bit different?
Yeah, no, I appreciate you bringing that up, and we have experienced that on a couple different IVD products, and I can appreciate what they're asking for, because one of the things we miss out on by not having someone, collect a sample, their own specimen, or perform, basically getting their own specimen, is we now can't see, okay, is the way they collected it going to match up and provide an effective or a usable sample. And I like that. To me, I feel like it's testing. It's testing the device in a couple different ways. It's saying, okay, if someone uses it, and does it match up what maybe an expert would get with the same process, right? So testing up what the user got compared to what an expert gets. But sometimes what we miss out on there is the actual collection process. So let's say it's maybe like a urine sample, and I don't know that it's appropriate to observe this happening. So you send someone to the restroom, and they get a sample back, and now let's say the sample doesn't match what the expert comes back with. Well, it's really hard to know why at that point. So how do we now change the device if we get a bunch of them that aren't matching? What do? We just know, well, they're not matching. But we don't know, is it because they didn't understand that they were, so how the amount they were supposed to collect, or they mixed it with water, or they did something else weird that we're just not able to observe. So I kind of think those things can be used in tandem, right? So you have the usability testing to observe many of the tasks that you might not be able to do, and then this, I think what they called it was true user testing, where they're actually getting a sample themselves, and comparing that to maybe like a clinician getting the sample. But yeah, I've definitely seen that, and I think it's worth really. One of the things that I would say in that case is a pre-sub is really helpful to get an idea of what is all the testing that's going to be required. Is a usability study going to be sufficient, or is another type of test going to be required as well?
On the flip side, when you're looking at let's take an IVD test where you have 2 lines versus 1 line. I've seen a lot of times the FDA is asking for, could you please show that a layperson can get the same interpretation of whether it's a positive or negative result versus a professional user, because they're trying to take a test that might have been professional before and prescription only to now make it an OTC version of the product. Is there any particular lessons learned or got-yous that you had in the process of those types of tests? Like, how do you have to design those usability studies differently to address, yes, we're getting the same interpretation of results for a layperson versus a professional user?
Yeah, so the study itself may be designed fairly similarly in the way we're evaluating comprehension of that particular message. But I think it's important to note that the way the message is, well, any labeling or messaging is worded, that we are taking into account the reader, right? So what is the potential ability of the reader? If we have a clinician, we can assume a certain level of education and understanding of medical terminology. But if we're now putting this out into the broad market, general population, over-the-counter products, it would be really important then to know that we can show comprehension by a wide range of people, including those who demonstrate signs of poor reading ability. So maybe giving reading comprehension tests before to ascertain their reading grade level, and then saying, okay, yes, people who are reading at like a fourth grade level, they can understand this message, as well as people reading at a seventh grade level and a high school level, because in reality, these products are going to be used by a wide range of people with different abilities, and reading comprehension is one that we've seen the FDA ask for explicitly when thinking about products that are used by general population.
Is there a specific way your company goes about recruiting users that are going to be at the low end of that reading comprehension?
We've done, the thing we've done most recently effectively is screening by phone with a short reading comprehension test, specifically related to healthcare literacy. The test that we use in that pre-screening is called the REALM test, REALM. And that is, I can't remember, it's 5 or 6 terms that they read. And so basically we'll send this out in an email, they read it back, and we can get, based on their ability to read each of these words without any issues, difficulties, assign them to a reading level. And then when they come in, we give them a second reading test that's a little bit, what I think, a little bit more granular. It's called the new vital sign. And that's also related to healthcare literacy. And so then we kind of use those two mechanisms to kind of determine their reading comprehension level, and report that back with the results.
Okay. Yeah, a lot of clients have asked, how do we go about recruiting subjects with different reading levels, and so I was curious how you went about doing that as a firm.
It's difficult, and we go through a lot of people before we get those that fit into our lower literacy groups, of course. So it can be difficult.
It was interesting that you used the waterfall diagram multiple times. Was that actually located in that TIR that you had referenced at the bottom of the slides?
No, no. So I forgot to talk about the TIR. So TIR 59 is an AMI document that describes.
All right, let me go back
Yep.
to the slide so people can actually see what I'm talking about. That one.
Yeah. So it's the TIR 59 integrates human factors into design controls, and what I did here was took that diagram and then thinking of where human factors fits in to that process. It really aligns with those 3 steps in our other diagram. So what better way to understand your user needs than to go out and visit them in their natural habitats, and document the use environment that they're working in and the tasks that they're completing. And then as you're doing the design, going through the design process, evaluating the designs, making sure that you're meeting those user needs, until lastly getting to the validation study. So I really see it as kind of these 3 touch points in that waterfall diagram for human factors.
Okay. One of the ways that I've been thinking more and more about design is using the V diagram from software. So are you familiar with that diagram as well?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So for those of you that are listening and are not familiar with it, in IEC 62304, which is a software standard for how to develop software for medical devices, they actually have a diagram they call the V diagram. And it's been described in one company by one person to me as taking the waterfall diagram and rotating it counterclockwise by like 45 degrees. And the verification and validation steps that are normally connecting the medical device with the user needs and the outputs with the inputs, those become sort of the iterative um, testing that you're doing in the V diagram. I'm not sure that's the best way to describe a V diagram. I think it's best to actually show a picture of it, but I think all design, ultimately, the design step that you're showing in the middle here, design process, the
Mhm.
middle step, that ends up being an iterative process. So to think of it, we're going to have inputs, we're going to design it, and then we're going to have outputs,
Yeah.
and it will only go through that process once is not realistic or even necessarily helpful.
Hmm.
And you had described the company should be identifying early on what some of those critical tasks are and designing some possible screening tests to figure out which design form factor might work well for usability and which form factors might not work well early on with some low fidelity sort of breadboard designs or something you clamp onto the table with a C clamp, something that's a little bit more crude. Work it out during the early design process before you finalize your outputs, before you've done any verification and validation testing. So it's really part of that formative testing. And I think that's something that I see very, very few companies actually doing. They do lots of iterative development, but they don't
Hmm.
have any, they don't integrate that with their software validation. They don't integrate that with their risk uh, management process, and they don't integrate it with human factors. And those three should be hand in hand. And if you have electromedical device, which 90% of the products I see now are electromedical,
Yep.
they almost all have to present human factors or usability testing to the electrical safety house. They have to provide software validation, and they have to provide risk analysis. And they show me a finished device that they're ready to put on the market or potentially already have on the market in Europe, and they're asking me, well, why do we have to do this human factors testing? And why do we have to provide all this information to the electrical safety testing lab? And I I don't know how to explain to them, like, you were supposed to do this a year ago. And so I looked back while you were going through the slides. I looked at my design plan, and it's an integrated risk management and design plan template. And I have in there for step 3, human factors could be done here, or it could be done in phase 4. And I think maybe I ought to change the way I teach people this to say, yes, it could be, but it probably should be done in both phases. You should be doing the formative testing in phase 3, the design process and design and development process, and you should be
Yep.
doing the summative testing or final validation testing that the FDA requires in your V&V process a little bit later on in phase 4 and phase 5.
Yep.
And that's getting lost on everybody out there because they don't think about it except in the context of, oh, that's a regulatory requirement. They don't see it as being an integral part of design.
Yes, and I think what happens is the if we take the FDA guidance, it talks so heavily about the validation testing, that final step, that is that is the hurdle to get over. I guess that's the bar you have to get over, and the way you get over it is by doing all of this early work. Um, to think that you could just go out, design a product, and get it through is just not realistic. You have to do all this other work, but because the document doesn't really describe all that early work in great detail, we're just looking at the bar and just, okay, how do we get over that bar with the least amount of work possible? And the formative work, the iterative work, really doesn't have to be that much of a hassle. It doesn't have to be that expensive. Definitely doesn't add time, from what I've seen, to the project timeline, because it's just coming in quick spurts and confirming or just redirecting slightly where you're going. And you know, but when you do them quick and fast and often, you know, they're not big events that change the whole direction of a product. It's just, okay, are we online? Ooh, we're off a little bit here. Let's redirect a little bit. Or yeah, hey, we're online. Great. Now we have more confidence continuing on. And confidence is worth a lot, actually, when, you know, yeah, I mean, it's just peace of mind, knowing you're moving in the right direction.
I I think that your comment about it doesn't need to lengthen the design process at all is an important take-home point. That if you do human factors just as this is a regulatory requirement and I'll do it after I've designed my device, you're missing all the value of doing human factors testing in the first place. Because most companies are going to take the approach of, well, how can I justify why this one failed user testing is still okay?
Mm-hmm.
Or can I put a warning in my IFU and that'll be good enough?
Yeah.
Whereas if it's an integral part of the development process, it doesn't lengthen the process at all. It should be, when you're trying to decide between connector 1, 2, and 3 for this electrical connection or some other type of connector, that should be something you're doing some usability testing, some formative testing on.
Yep.
And I don't think a lot of people think that way because they're not well trained on human factors. They're not well trained in risk management, and they're design engineers that may not even be well trained in how to document design. So they look at a lot of those activities as something, they throw the design over the wall, the
Yeah.
virtual cubicle wall, and hand it off to regulatory and quality, and they let those people document it all because that's not part of their job. Whereas
Yep.
it really should be, everybody is well trained on risk, human factors, and design, and they document it as they go along. And that way, all those things are done by the time you get to the point where you're ready to put something in front of the FDA.
Agreed.
I think we've gone on for quite a while here, so I think I'm going to stop the recording now. But if anybody is interested in learning more about Research Collective, we'll certainly provide links on the website so you can contact Research Collective directly. In addition to that, Research Collective was kind enough to actually write a human factors procedure for us. So that's available on our website for purchase. And Research Collective, their logo is even on the procedure. So they've actually were the authors of it, but we've read through it, really, really like that. And probably the most valuable part of that entire presentation, or the entire procedure, is that there's a protocol provided as well, and we thought that protocol was really well written and very valuable. So thank you very much for your time, Bryant. We really appreciate it, and hoping our clients and future clients get a lot of value out of this.
Great. Thanks again, Rob. Appreciate getting to talk to you, and thanks for the time.
You're welcome. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye.